I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow over the meticulously arranged living room. It was a room that radiated comfort, much like the life I thought Molly and I had built together. 9 years of marriage had seen us through highs and lows, job promotions, a couple of cross-country moves, and the birth of our son, Jeremy. We had what anyone would call a picture-perfect life. Or so I believed. Molly was the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly. With her sparkling blue eyes, sun-kissed blonde hair, and a laugh that could light up a room, she seemed to carry an aura of magnetism everywhere she went. She worked as a senior manager in her firm, traveling often to oversee projects. I was proud of her, until I wasn't. I suppose it started with the trips. The frequency of her travel had increased steadily over the past year. At first, I barely noticed. Her schedule had always been hectic, and I trusted her implicitly. Then came the subtle changes. She started dressing sharper than usual for casual meetings, and became increasingly protective of her phone. If I questioned her, she'd wave me off with a smile and a kiss. I dismissed my doubts as paranoia. The turning point came on a seemingly ordinary Thursday. Molly was rushing around the house, packing for a weekend business trip. Jeremy, oblivious to the tension bubbling beneath the surface, sat at the dining table, scribbling furiously on his homework. I handed Molly her coffee as she zipped up her suitcase. "Where to this time?" I asked casually. "Chicago," she replied, not meeting my eyes. "The usual. Just meetings and a quick team dinner. I'll be back Sunday night." "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Text me when you land." She nodded, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and breezed out the door. Jeremy waved goodbye, his focus never leaving his math problem. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, a knot forming in my stomach. Something felt off. I couldn't place it, but it gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that evening, as I prepped dinner, Molly's phone lit up on the counter. She'd forgotten it in her rush, a rare occurrence. I glanced at the screen, intending to silence it, but the preview caught my attention. "Can't wait to see you again, beautiful. Last weekend was unforgettable." My heart stopped. The message was from someone named Nick. I knew that name, she'd mentioned a colleague with that name before. But her tone had always been casual, dismissive even. This message, however, painted a very different picture. I stared at the phone, paralyzed. For a moment, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a joke. A harmless text taken out of context. But the knot in my stomach tightened, and I knew better. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I decided to wait, to gather more information before making any accusations. That weekend, while she was supposedly in Chicago, I started piecing things together. The first thing I did was check her emails. She'd left her laptop open, and I scrolled through her inbox. Most of it was mundane work correspondence, but a folder labeled Miscellaneous caught my eye. Inside, I found a chain of emails between Molly and Nick. What began as professional exchanges gradually shifted to personal notes. There were jokes, compliments, and eventually, plans to meet for dinner. Then came the clincher, a hotel booking confirmation for a weekend in New York. A weekend Molly had told me she was visiting her sister. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Every detail of our life flashed through my mind, now tainted with suspicion. The late-night phone calls, the business trips that seemed to multiply out of nowhere, the sudden attention to her appearance, it all made sense now. She was having an affair. But I needed more proof. Something undeniable. Something she couldn't wriggle out of. My next move was to check our bank statements. Sure enough, there were charges for luxury hotels and fine dining, none of which matched the cities Molly claimed to visit. It was clear she wasn't staying at the standard business class hotels her company typically booked for employees. No, these were personal trips she had carefully kept off my radar. I spent that weekend in a haze, swinging between rage and heartbreak. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at Jeremy, I felt a pang of guilt. What would this do to him? How could I protect him from the fallout of his mother's betrayal? Molly returned Sunday evening, all smiles and chatter, as if nothing was amiss. She hugged Jeremy tightly and ruffled his hair before joining me in the kitchen. Chicago was exhausting, she said, leaning against the counter. I swear, these conferences get duller every year. I forced a smile, nodding as if I believed her. But inside, I was screaming. I wanted to demand answers, to throw the evidence in her face and watch her squirm. But I held back. I needed to be methodical. If she wanted to play games, she would soon find out I could play them better. Over the next week, I laid the groundwork for what would become my revenge. I started making calls, checking credit card statements, and even sifting through old receipts Molly had carelessly left in her purse. The evidence piled up, each piece a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not without a plan. Confrontation would be too easy, too satisfying in the short term. But I wanted something bigger, something that would leave an impact she wouldn't forget. Molly thought she had the upper hand, but she had no idea what was coming. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Every time Molly smiled at me, I felt a wave of nausea. Every time she leaned in for a kiss, my skin crawled. The betrayal clung to me like a second skin, and yet I kept my mask firmly in place. For Jeremy's sake, I played the doting husband, knowing full well it was a role she had already abandoned. Monday morning began like any other. Molly was already gone by the time I woke up, her neatly folded gym bag sitting in the corner of the room. She always left for yoga early on Mondays, a routine I now questioned like everything else. Jeremy munched on his cereal, his eyes glued to the TV, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface of our seemingly normal home. I kissed him on the forehead and promised we'd play catch after school. He gave me a bright smile, the kind only kids can pull off, full of trust and innocence. It broke my heart to know that trust would be shattered soon. After dropping him off at school, I parked in a quiet lot and stared at my phone. It was time to dig deeper. I logged into our shared phone account, a routine I had never considered before Molly's betrayal. Her call history was uneventful, work numbers, the occasional chat with her mom. But one number stood out, appearing repeatedly at odd hours. I copied it and ran it through an online reverse phone lookup. Nick. The name confirmed what I already knew. It wasn't just the calls, though. The text logs were more damning. Dozens of messages, often late at night, filled with emojis and clipped phrases I couldn't read but didn't need to. It was all there, laid bare. I saved screenshots of everything, ensuring I had a digital record of her deceit. For the rest of the day, I tried to work, but focus eluded me. My co-workers noticed my distraction, and I waved it off with a joke about too much caffeine. Inside, I was seething. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity, each second another reminder of the betrayal I was living with. That evening, Molly came home earlier than usual. She carried herself with an air of exhaustion, as if the weight of her double life was finally beginning to show. I made dinner while she sat at the counter, scrolling through her phone. For a moment, I wanted to snatch it from her hands and confront her. But no, I wasn't ready. Not yet. Jeremy said you promised to play catch with him today, Molly said, her tone neutral. I did, I replied. We had fun. She nodded absently, barely looking up from her screen. The sight of her, so nonchalant, so comfortable in her lies, set my teeth on edge. After dinner, I excused myself to the garage. It was my sanctuary, the one place where I could think without interruption. I sat at my workbench, staring at the neatly arranged tools I hadn't touched in days. The quiet hum of the overhead light was my only companion as I mapped out my next move. It wasn't enough to confront her, I wanted to dismantle the facade she had so carefully constructed. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand the gravity of what she had done. And I wanted her to see that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. The first step was securing our finances. I logged into our joint bank account and transferred a significant portion of our savings into a separate account under my name. Molly's spending habits had become erratic, expensive dinners, unexplained withdrawals, and I wasn't about to let her drain me dry. I left just enough in the joint account to keep her from noticing the missing funds, at least for now. Next, I contacted a private investigator. His name was Rick, a gruff, no-nonsense type who came highly recommended by a friend. We met at a coffee shop the next afternoon, and I laid everything out for him, the texts, the emails, the receipts. Rick listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. "You've already done half my job," he said, flipping through the folder of evidence I'd compiled. "But if you want the full picture, I'll need access to her schedule. Any way you can get that?" "I'll figure it out," I replied. He handed me a card with his contact information. "I'll start tailing her this week. If she's meeting this Nick guy, we'll know soon enough." I felt a strange mix of relief and dread as I left the coffee shop. Relief that I was finally taking control, dread at what I might uncover. As much as I already knew, part of me still clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding, that there was some explanation I hadn't considered. But deep down, I knew better. That week was torture. I went through the motions of daily life, keeping up appearances while Rick did his work. Molly seemed oblivious, though her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She was more distracted than usual, often retreating to her office to make phone calls she claimed were work-related. When I passed by, I could hear her muffled voice through the door, but the words were indistinct. On Thursday evening, Rick called with an update. His voice was calm, professional, but the words hit me like a freight train. "She's been seeing him," he said. "Dinner at a downtown restaurant 2 nights ago. They left together. I followed them to a hotel." I closed my eyes, the confirmation washing over me like a tidal wave. "Did you get pictures?" "I did," Rick replied. "You'll have them by morning." After hanging up, I sat in the darkened garage, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The anger I'd kept bottled up threatened to spill over, but I forced it down. There was no room for emotion now. I had to stay focused, stay in control. The next morning, the envelope arrived. Inside were the photos, grainy but unmistakable. Molly and Nick, arm in arm, laughing over dinner. Molly and Nick entering the hotel, her hand resting casually on his arm. Molly and Nick leaving the next morning, looking far too comfortable with each other. I stared at the images for what felt like hours, my emotions warring within me. The love I'd once felt for her was buried beneath layers of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. But alongside those feelings was something else, something darker. Determination. If Molly wanted to betray me, I would make sure she paid for it. Not with anger or violence, that wasn't my style. No, my revenge would be cold, calculated, and unforgettable. She had built her world on lies, and I was going to bring it crashing down around her. The photos sat on the kitchen table, staring back at me like a dare. Each one told a story I never wanted to hear, Molly's hand resting on Nick's arm, her smile brighter than I'd seen it in years. The intimacy in those images was undeniable. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a mockery of everything we'd built together. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what had happened. Molly wasn't just cheating, she was living a double life, carving out a world where I didn't exist. And yet, I kept the mask on. If she wanted to play the game, I'd see it through to the end. That weekend, Molly announced she had another business trip. "It's a quick one," she said, avoiding my gaze. Just one night. I'll be back Sunday afternoon. I nodded, my face a mask of neutrality. Safe travels, I said, my voice calm, measured. Inside, my mind raced. This was the perfect opportunity. As soon as she left, I put my plan into action. First, I went to her office. I'd never been one to pry, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Her desk drawers were locked, but the keys were hanging on a small hook by the door. It took less than a minute to open them. Inside, I found a leather-bound planner, the kind she used to joke about when everyone else had moved to digital calendars. Flipping through the pages, I found her itinerary. Every trip, every meeting, meticulously documented. But there was a pattern. Several of her work trips coincided with Nick's business schedule. Cities matched, dates matched, it was all there. I took photos of the planner with my phone, careful to leave everything exactly as I'd found it. Then I moved to the closet. Among her neatly hung clothes was a small locked box. I almost laughed at how cliché it felt, but the box was heavy, and I was curious. I didn't have the key, but a quick internet search showed me how to pop the lock with a bobby pin. Inside were items that made my stomach churn, a pair of tickets to a concert I didn't know she'd attended, a keycard for a hotel I'd never stayed in, and a handwritten note from Nick. The words were sweet, cloying, and entirely inappropriate for a married woman. Molly, you're the best part of my life. I can't wait for our next weekend together. All my love, Nick. I photographed everything and left the box as it was. By the time I finished, my anger was tempered with grim satisfaction. Molly had left a trail, and I intended to follow it to the bitter end. That night, I sat down with Jeremy to watch a movie. He picked an old animated film we'd seen a dozen times, but I didn't mind. His laughter filled the room, a small comfort in the chaos of my thoughts. He was the reason I couldn't lose control. Whatever happened next, I had to protect him. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. She was sharp, efficient, and unflinchingly direct. After laying out the evidence, I explained my plan. I want full custody of Jeremy, I said. I want the house, and I want to freeze her access to our joint accounts. Can we do that? The lawyer nodded. With the evidence you have, it's possible. Judges don't look kindly on infidelity, especially when there's a child involved. But you'll need to be ready for a fight. Molly may push back, especially if she feels cornered. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling over me. I'm ready, I said. Whatever it takes. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I closed the account Molly used for her trips and transferred the remaining funds into a separate account under my name. I didn't empty it completely, I wanted her to notice but not panic. It was all part of the setup. When Sunday afternoon arrived, I was waiting in the kitchen when Molly walked through the door. She looked tired, but there was a glow to her cheeks I hadn't seen in months. My stomach turned at the sight of it. Hey, she said, dropping her bag by the door. How was your weekend? Fine, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. How was your trip? She hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. Busy. Lots of meetings. I barely had time to breathe. I nodded, watching her closely. Sounds exhausting. You should rest. She smiled, clearly relieved by my lack of questioning, and disappeared upstairs. As soon as she was out of earshot, I texted Rick. She's back. Did you get everything? His reply was immediate. Got it. You'll have the full report by morning. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I knew Rick would have followed her, capturing every moment of her weekend with Nick. The proof was coming, and once I had it, there would be no room for denial. That evening, I found myself alone in the garage again, the hum of the overhead light a soothing background noise. I stared at the photos, the receipts, the texts, all the pieces of Molly's betrayal. It was a strange feeling, holding her lies in my hands. Part of me wanted to throw them in her face, to watch her squirm under the weight of her deceit. But I wasn't ready yet. Not until everything was in place. The next morning, Rick's report arrived. It was thorough, complete with timestamps and high-resolution images. Molly and Nick at dinner. Molly and Nick entering the hotel. Molly and Nick leaving together the next morning. It was irrefutable. I sat at the kitchen table, the folder spread out in front of me. The weight of it was crushing, but there was also a strange sense of liberation. The truth was out, and now I could act. Molly came downstairs, her hair damp from the shower. She smiled when she saw me, but it faltered as her eyes fell on the open folder. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. I met her gaze, my expression calm but cold. "You tell me." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the photos. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. "Where did you get those?" "I think the better question is why you thought you could hide this from me," I replied. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, Molly looked small, vulnerable. But I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. The time for games was over. Molly sat across from me, her face pale, the damning evidence spread between us. Her eyes darted to the photos, the receipts, the texts, all the proof of her betrayal. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "I guess you thought you were clever," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. "All those late-night meetings, the business trips. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" "Let me explain," she finally stammered, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Don't insult me," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "I have all the evidence I need. The lies, the deceit. You're not going to talk your way out of this." She looked away, her hands trembling as she reached for her glass of water. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "It was a mistake. A mistake that lasted over a year." I asked, raising an eyebrow. "How convenient." The weight of the confrontation was almost unbearable. Part of me wanted to explode, to unleash the anger I'd been bottling up. But I stayed composed. I couldn't lose control, not when I was so close to the endgame. Molly leaned forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "I still love you," she said. "I made a terrible mistake, but I want to fix this. Please, we can work through it. For Jeremy." Her mention of Jeremy sent a jolt of anger through me, but I forced it down. "You should have thought about Jeremy before you started sleeping with Nick," I said coldly. "You don't get to play the devoted mother now." She flinched as if I'd struck her, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of genuine remorse. But it wasn't enough, not after everything she'd done. "You're right," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I can't lose you. I can't lose our family." I stood, unable to look at her any longer. "You already have," I said simply. "The divorce papers are ready. You'll hear from my lawyer tomorrow." Her sobs followed me as I walked out of the kitchen, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Molly fought hard at first, but the evidence I'd gathered left her with little leverage. The house went to me, along with full custody of Jeremy. She was left with visitation rights and a modest settlement, not that it mattered. Her affair had cost her everything, and she knew it. Jeremy adjusted surprisingly well. I'd been honest with him, at least as much as a child his age could handle. "Mom and Dad just need to live in different houses," I told him. "But we both love you very much." It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough for now. Life settled into a new rhythm. I focused on my job, my son, and rebuilding the pieces of my life that Molly had shattered. But something still gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. Despite everything, I didn't feel the closure I'd expected. The revenge, the victory, it all felt hollow. Then, one day, it all changed. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a man standing on the porch, holding a thick envelope. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor that exuded authority. "Mr. Harrison?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, wary. "Can I help you?" He handed me the envelope. "You've been served," he said simply. Confused, I opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside. My blood ran cold as the words registered. It was a lawsuit. Molly was suing me, for defamation. She claimed that the evidence I presented during the divorce was fabricated, that I had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to ruin her reputation and take Jeremy from her. The photos, the receipts, even the private investigator's report, she alleged it was all a carefully constructed lie. I laughed bitterly, the absurdity of it all washing over me. But as I read further, my amusement turned to dread. Molly wasn't acting alone. She had Nick backing her, along with a lawyer who specialized in cases like this. They were coming for me with everything they had. The trial was a nightmare. Molly played the victim beautifully, painting me as a manipulative husband who couldn't handle losing control. Nick testified, claiming their relationship had been purely professional and that I had planted the evidence to frame them. Even the private investigator, Rick, was called into question, his credibility attacked at every turn. Despite my best efforts, the case turned against me. The judge ruled in Molly's favor, awarding her a significant portion of my assets and shared custody of Jeremy. The house, my savings, even my dignity, it all slipped through my fingers like sand. In the end, I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. Molly and Nick walked away unscathed, their lies now validated by the court. And Jeremy, my sweet, innocent son, was caught in the crossfire, his life upended by the chaos we had created. As I packed up my belongings and prepared to leave the house that had once been my sanctuary, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd played the game wrong. I'd wanted revenge, but in the end, it was Molly who had the last laugh. And as the door closed behind me, the only thing I could hear was the echo of her parting words, "You should have just let it go, Billy. Some things aren't worth fighting for."